Okay.
This is cute.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session of Pragnya Cultural Society's interactive discussions. Today, we'll be talking about the pre-med pathway and getting into med school. My name is Netra, and I'm one of the members of Pragnya Cultural Society's youth team. We have 3 more members of the youth team with us today, Samira, Aman, and Ria. In Pragnya Cultural Society's interactive discussions, we talk with many people in various pathways to answer questions that you all might have. We, the youth team, facilitate these sessions. Our first session was with Harish Bayana. We will have a new special guest every month, so stay tuned for future sessions. Today, we'll start off by asking questions that we gathered in the Google form that we sent out on the flyer. For every session, we will send out a flyer and a Google form prior to the meeting where you can put your questions in. After, you all will be able to ask her questions directly. While we, your MCs, ask her questions, we ask that you keep your mics muted so that we don't get any background noise. Today's special guest is, drumroll please, Spandana Madhava. We are very grateful to have you here today. Before we get started, let me give a quick intro about Spandana. She's from our very own North County, San Marcos since 2002, and she was very invested in the community she grew up in. She participated in many youth commissions as chair of the San Marcos Youth Commissions. She's very passionate about women's health and women's empowerment. She graduated from Mission Hills High School in 2013 and went on to pursue her bachelor's degree in psychobiology and global health at UCLA. After graduation, she spent 1 year as an associate at Triage Consulting Group in where she learned about hospital finance and medical billing. After that, she moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and she is currently a 3rd-year medical student at A.T. Still University School of, I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrongly, but osteopathic medicine in Arizona.
That was good.
Thank you. And also thank you all for coming. And without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start asking the questions. So our first question for you, Spandana, is, well, first, hi.
Hi.
Hi. So the first question is, how did you decide that you wanted to pursue a medical pathway?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that introduction. That was really nice. I'm really happy to be here. So in terms of pursuing medicine, growing up, I didn't really have any family members in the medical field. Both my parents weren't in the medical field or anything. But growing up, we used to help a lot of the people in our community who are going through health issues in the hospital, stuff like that. So we would just do any sort of service we could. Our, Indian community is very well, everyone kind of knows each other and wants to help each other out. So we would help with transportation or help with like translation, in the hospital, or we would, bring food to our close family friends who are going through some tough times, stuff like that. So that's kind of my first introduction into the healthcare field. And I just really liked learning about, all the things that were going on in healthcare. And I really enjoyed learning about the human body and seeing people get better and recovering and stuff like that. So that was my first introduction, really. But when I truly became, I think, passionate about it was in high school. I joined this internship program at Palomar Medical Center. It's the one in Escondido. And at that time, they were actually just starting to build it. So I got to be a part of their inaugural day, and I rotated in a bunch of different specialties in the ER, in oncology, med-surg, the women's health department, all of these different departments, and I got to help with care. So I worked with the nurses, the CNAs, the doctors, and I really got to see what patient bedside care was like. And I really liked that. So then going into college, I had this in the back of my mind and I was very curious about other fields as well, but I always kind of fell back onto medicine. And when I was in undergrad, I did a lot of work with I scribed for 3 years and I did a lot of work in mobile clinics and things like that. And I just kept really falling back into it and really loving it. So then I just decided I wanted to be a doctor. And I think it's been a great field. There's no other field like it where you get to take care of people when they're at their most vulnerable. And since then, I've really liked being in the medical field. So yeah.
Wow, thank you. So the next question is, when did you decide for sure that you wanted to specialize in OBGYN?
So I actually have not decided for sure. So the way it works is in medical school, your first 2 years are primarily lectures and didactic work, studying for board exams, things like that. So you're just learning about how the human body works, all of the different systems in the body. And then at the end of your second year, you take a board exam. And then your third and fourth years are when you do rotations in hospitals and clinics. So every month is a different specialty, basically. So I've gone through family med, OBGYN, pediatrics. Currently, I'm in my surgery rotation, which has been really crazy with COVID and everything. But I think some people have an idea of exactly what they want to go into when they decide to go to medical school. Some people are usually more broad and they have an idea of what they're interested in. But for me, and what I see myself doing, I really like working with women, and I really like, having long-lasting patient interaction and patient relationships. And for that, family med and OB-GYN seem to make the most sense to me. So hopefully I'll be able to decide in the next couple of months here, but I'm deciding between family medicine and OB-GYN.
Wow, that's very interesting. So I'm going to move on to Smira.
Hi, I'm Smera. Nice to meet you, Spandana. Okay,
Nice to meet you.
my questions are, what's the journey from freshman undergrad to medical school freshman like? What's the application process like as well?
Yeah, definitely. So let's see. So when you join undergrad as a freshman, you might have an idea that you want to go to medical school. Oftentimes people are gung-ho that medicine is exactly what they want to pursue, but a good amount of the time people are just considering it. So as a freshman, what should be your main focus really is getting a good GPA. Learning how to study well for your classes, because that in and of itself is a transition, right? Going from high school into college level courses is a transition. So you should really try to get the best GPA that you can, do well in your courses. Sometimes people major in a STEM field, but to get into medical school, you actually do not have to major in a STEM field. The reason why people major in STEM fields is because oftentimes the requirements for medical school, like physics, chemistry, biochem, biology, overlap with the requirements for your major. So for example, I majored in psychobiology because I enjoyed psych and sociology and biology, but also because it overlapped with requirements for medical school. But you can actually major in anything you want. You can major in English if you wanted, or you could major in sociology. You can major in anything, as long as you also take classes in those requirements. So as a freshman, that should be your main goal, is to do well in school. And then come sophomore year, you slowly start adding on extracurricular activities. So these can be things that are related to the medical field, like scribing or being an EMT or working in a mobile clinic or research, anything like that. But you can also start adding non-medically related things. And I think both are equally important. So just start getting involved in things that you like doing, like working with kids or working, with the underserved population, whatever. And then between your sophomore and your junior year is when you should really start deciding when it is that you want to apply to medical school. And by that time, hopefully you would have an idea of, what your requirements are, what your timeline looks like. So if you feel like you have a good bearing on your GPA and everything, that's when you should really start taking your Mcat, which is your junior year. And the Mcat is the admissions test that's required to get into medical school. When I took it like 5-6 years ago, it was an 8-hour test. It covers chemistry, biology, psychology, physics, and reading comprehension. I think due to COVID, they've condensed it. I believe it's a 5.5 hour test now, but those requirements continue to change. So you take that in your junior year, and you want to do well in it. Sometimes people take courses to study for that. Sometimes people just self-study. And the application process actually takes a whole year to matriculate into medical school. So if you would like to go straight into medical school right after your undergraduate, then you should start applying to medical school before you start your 4th year of undergraduate. And the reason for that is you start your application in June before your 4th year starts. You submit it, you start getting interviews, you interview all through the fall, you get your acceptance in spring, and you matriculate the following summer. And if you choose to take a gap year, which we can talk about separately as well, then that would sort of delay your application process. The application itself consists of your GPA, making sure you've taken all of your required courses. It consists of your Mcat score. It consists of your extracurriculars, which could include research, volunteering, leadership, all of that. And it consists of your personal statement. So once you have all of that submitted, the application is usually open around June 1st, and it is a rolling admissions basis. So the sooner you submit, the sooner you're going to start getting responses from medical schools. And so people submit their primary application, and then you slowly start getting secondary applications from these medical schools. And those usually consists of essay questions, short answer questions, things like that for individual medical schools to get more information about you. And again, you want to submit those as soon as possible. And then once you submit those, if the medical schools like you, then they will start to give you interview invites, and you start interviewing between, I want to say, August through December. And you start interviewing at all these different medical schools, and usually they should get back to you anywhere from 2 weeks after you interview all the way up until June. So there's a really huge span of when you could hear back from medical schools. But that's kind of the lowdown on how the process goes. If you have any more specific questions, I'd be happy to kind of clarify or anything. I think you're muted.
What is the most important aspect of the medical school application? Because like you talked about, that seems like a really important part getting into medical school.
Yes, it's probably the most important part into getting into medical school. But so like I said, there's the GPA, Mcat, extracurricular activities, and then your personal statement. So the way it was explained to me, and the way I think I've seen it in my peers, is that you want to make sure you have a good GPA and Mcat as baseline. Once you have that baseline, what sets you apart from all the other applicants is your personal statement, because that's really the only thing that's going to be different from everybody else, right? They're not going to know what type of person you are from just a score. So the personal statement, which was drilled into me, is the most important part, is really the only way that they can start to get to know you as a person. So similar to undergraduate applications, the medical school application is essentially a way for you to sell yourself to these medical schools. What is your purpose? Why do you want to be a doctor? What makes you tick? And all of that should be outlined in your personal statement. So it really needs to be a cohesive insight onto who you are as a person and what good you're going to do as a doctor. But that being said, it's also a way for you to explain any shortcomings in your application. If you had a hard time getting used to studying in undergrad, if you had a hard time getting a good Mcat score, all of these things that might be shortcomings in your application, it's a really good time to explain that as well. So I think the personal statement is the most important part, as long as you can meet those threshold scores for your GPA and your Mcat.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna pass it on to Ria. Ria, you can go ahead and start.
Hi, I'm Ria, and I want to say thank you for coming here today, Spandana. We're very glad to have you here and talk about the medical field. So today I have 2 questions for you, actually 3. Our first question would be for pre-med, how much does the school matter? Do some schools or pathways offer different opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good question. So in terms of school, there is a quote that somebody gave me this quote when I was in high school, and it's do what you can, where you are, with what you have. So with that, there are pros and cons to both going to, big academic institutions that have associated healthcare systems, but there are also pros and cons to going to smaller universities. And to kind of outline that, so I went to a big institution. I went to UCLA. They have their own healthcare system, have a lot of resources. And so some of the pros about going to a school like that is that you have a lot of resources. There's a lot of opportunity for research. There's a lot of opportunity to get a job in healthcare. There's a lot of student groups that are doing the same thing that you want to do. There are a lot of people that you can look up to and get mentorship from and things like that. Some of the cons to going to a school like that is that everybody wants to do exactly what you want to do. So there's a lot of competition. So my chemistry classes would be like 500 people and 90% of them would be pre-med. So there's a lot of competition, and it's very easy to kind of get bogged down by that. But at the same time, it's a big school, and it's easy to find, to make your own little niche in a big school. But that being said, there's less guidance in terms of counselors, just because of the sheer amount of people who want to do the same thing that you want to do. So you really have to look out for opportunities on your own, and it's a lot of networking and that sort of thing. In terms of smaller schools, the pros to going to a smaller school may be that you're a big fish in a small pond, right? So there's less people trying to compete for the same opportunities. Your professors will get to know you more. If you're doing research or have any leadership, just you have more close connections with people around you. Some of the cons might be that there just aren't as many resources. People might not know where you're from or your school or anything like that. But this brings me back to do what you can where you are with what you have, right? You have to take advantage of the opportunities that are in front of you. So I think being on this side of it now, it doesn't really matter where you go to school to go to medical school. Nobody really cares about what your undergraduate institution is. Nobody cares, like if you graduated top of your class, nobody cares about any of that. What they care about is how you utilize the opportunities that you were given, and how you kind of took advantage of that. So while I wouldn't focus too much on what school you go to, if you happen to not get into a 4-year university, totally fine. You can, go to a 2-year university and transfer out and still get your bachelor's degree. The most important part of all of this is getting a bachelor's degree, figuring out what it is that you want to do, why you want to be a doctor, and seeking out these opportunities wherever you are. The name doesn't matter as much as it is how you kind of paved your own path. And that's what people talk about in their personal statements as well. So there are pros and cons, and I think you as a person can reflect and see what you like more. If you want the college experience, maybe go to a bigger school. If you like, just smaller, intimate situations, then maybe go to a smaller school. But you can become a doctor regardless of what school or what type of school you go to.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely those small words just like get someone to do something and make them more interested in what they want to do. But how did you balance your schedule during undergrad? How does time management then compare to medical school?
Good question. So in undergrad, the funny thing is that you are balancing a million and one things, right? You're balancing your schoolwork, your extracurriculars, your social time, research, whatever. You're balancing all of these things that are all equally important to get into medical school. So in undergrad, time flew, but I think that it's just you take it day by day and your priorities. In medical school, however, is when you finally get to learn about things that you want to learn about. And studying becomes less of a chore and more of a joy. So, and the other thing is in medical school, you have less things to focus on. Like your main job as a medical student is to learn things to help your patients in the future, right? So the first 2 years, all you're really focused on is whatever subject matter you're learning. And you might volunteer here and there, you might have research here and there, but your main goal is to learn the information and get a good board score. And then come third and fourth year, it's like a job. You work the same hours as your doctor, you go to clinic, you have the same holidays as your doctor, stuff like that. So it becomes less to balance. The struggle, however, with medical school, and I think this is maybe what you were getting at in terms of balancing, is that it's not so much what you're learning that's the difficult part. The subject matter itself is interesting and not super difficult to understand. The difficult part is that the sheer amount of information that you are required to learn in 2 years is insane. And there's an analogy, it's called like drinking out of a fire hose, right? Like there's so much information coming at you at one time, and you're trying to grasp as much of it as you can. So that's where the balancing issue comes in your first 2 years. Trying to come up with a good study schedule, trying to figure out how to study in medical school, because it is very different from studying in undergraduate or high school even. So people usually take a couple months to kind of get their study schedule down and figure out what works for them. And that's a very common struggle people have their first year of medical school. So that's usually the tough part. But I think after you figure that out, it's way better. And it's just a different challenge, but definitely doable.
So yeah, what was your mindset through all this? Like, what was your mindset that got you through high school, undergrad, and finally to med school?
My mindset, two things. For me, balance is like the most important thing for me. For me, I knew that in order to be able to take care of other people, I had to take care of myself first. So that was like things like knowing what my goal was in the future, to take care of my patients, to have a practice, to be able to, serve the people that I want to. I have to also make sure that I'm balancing all these other things in my life, right? And I'm sure, like a lot of people say, it's like you're in it for the long haul. So it's more of a marathon than it is a sprint. So making sure you're taking time for yourself. And for me, that was, seeing my family and working out, things like that. Doing things that you enjoy and taking those breaks to kind of, keep you on for the long haul. And that's usually what keeps people going. But going from high school to college to undergrad, what kind of got me through was just knowing that there was nothing else that I would want to do. Like there is a huge need for primary care providers, and more so there's a huge need for culturally sensitive care. For Indian, South Asian people, we might be a minority in the US, but we are definitely not a minority in medicine. There are a lot of us in medicine. But at the same time, there are not as many of us providing very culturally sensitive care. So that's always been kind of my goal and what I want. So you really have to look inwards and see what your purpose is, because this is one of those fields that if you're doing it for somebody else, or if you're doing it for the money or something like that, it's very hard to sustain. So it has to be something that you really want to do and something that keeps you going. And so the best way to figure that out, though, is by shadowing and putting yourself in these situations, like, internships, or if you have any family friends who are doctors, like asking if you can shadow them and seeing if it's truly what you want to do. And then, the motivation will just kind of come on its own because you won't want to do anything else.
Thank you so much, Spandana. That was very helpful and detailed. Now I will hand it off to Aman.
Thank you. Hi, Spandana. Again, yeah, it's, so far, like, there's a lot of useful information. And yeah, so I'll just get right into my 4 questions. So going back to what you were talking about in terms of like what you do during like med school and like pre-med, like you were talking about extracurriculars. So what extracurriculars do you recommend like during undergrad, and what about during med school? Specifically, like, what about research? What about internships and all of that? So what do you have to say on that?
Great question. So in undergrad, first priority should be grades, right? So like once you get your grades down, then start thinking about extracurriculars. And you should aim to have 1 to 2 clinically oriented extracurricular activities. So what does that mean? It means that you're working with other people, patients in the medical field. So this can be things like scribing, working as an EMT, an emergency medical technician. It can be things like clinical research, so working with other patients. So you can see like what is my life going to look like in the future. So that's a couple things. So what I did was I worked as a scribe for 3.5 years in undergrad. So I worked in family practice, and then I worked in child psychiatry, and I would follow the physician and basically notate everything that was going on. And, in the medical field, say you go to the doctor, right? And oftentimes doctors have their computers in front of them and they're like writing down as they're trying to answer. So that's what I did. So that allowed the doctor to spend more time with the patient and not have to be in front of a computer. But simultaneously, I was learning so much being in that environment. So I did that, and you can often get paid for that as well. I have friends who used to be an EMT, and you can get paid for being an EMT as well. You get EMT training, and you are basically a paramedic. You respond to all emergencies. If you go to a big university, they often have their own EMT programs where you can train and work for them. If not, the county, there are paramedics everywhere. So you can do that if that's something that you like. In terms of research, it is a thing that a lot of people feel like they really need to do. And my advice for research is do it if you like it. And it's important to keep in mind that research comes in lots of different forms. So for me personally, I did research for about 2 years at UCLA. My research was more clinical research. So I worked on obesity and fat shaming. So what it means to do clinical research is that you are working with human subjects. However, there can be wet lab research, whereas you're working, on drugs or working with testing drugs or testing chemicals. So these are more, where you're actually in a wet lab and quote unquote what people picture when they're thinking of research. But regardless of what you do, make sure you enjoy it. Some people choose to do research and they really find a good lab and a good PI, and they're able to get published. And if that's your goal and if that's interesting to you, like by all means do it. But I do know a lot of people who just research is not their thing. and it's okay. And it can sometimes be hard to find research opportunities. And people know that. So there are ways to bolster your application otherwise, by finding leadership opportunities and volunteering and things like that. So outside of these clinical things that you can do, I do think it's also very important to get involved in non-medical extracurriculars. Why? Because you want to be a well-rounded person. You want to be able to have a conversation with your interviewer and talk to them about something that has nothing to do with medicine. For me, that was, I worked as a tour guide while I was there in undergrad for 2 years, and we worked as a part of undergraduate admission, and we were kind of like the forefront for all of UCLA admissions. So if people called the school asking about admissions advice or things like that, we were the people who helped them. We were also the people who gave you the tours if you came to our campus, and I loved doing that. I also was a part of an a cappella team. So like, these are things that had nothing to do with medicine at all, but I truly enjoyed, that, you should also kind of keep in mind, like if you like playing a sport, play a sport. If you like, playing an instrument, join some sort of like band or music club or something like that. So it's equally important to do both medical and non-medical extracurriculars.
Thank you. That was a lot of good advice, and I especially like the part where you were talking about like how to balance between like doing both non-medical and medical extracurriculars. I think that's a big thing. And me speaking from experience and like from what I've heard from my peers, yeah, a lot of people like we keep overlooking the fact that like, oh yeah, we need to think about doing like pursuing things outside of what we want for our career. We need to like sort of like become an all-rounded student, and that's like a big thing. So now the next question I had is a bit of a broad one. What tips do you have? Like, what are some big tips that you can give to aspiring medical students, just in general, for pursuing any medical career?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So, okay, I guess two things. So for an aspiring medical student, the number one thing to do, or not do actually, is do not compare yourself to anybody. Medicine is it's getting better, don't get me wrong, but going through the medical school, like curriculum and just going through the whole journey, there's a lot of people who can be very competitive, and that's what it is, right? To do medicine, you have to be, very ambitious. You have to be very goal-oriented, focused, all of these things, which are good. It's good to be that way. But sometimes that can lead to being very competitive, and can bring out very like toxic things. And that's something that the medical field is notorious about, especially certain parts of the medical field. And it's very easy to compare yourself and thinking like, oh, I'm not doing enough, or like, I'm not good enough for this. And you can have like a bit of imposter syndrome, especially in undergrad applying to medical school. And it really, truly never ends. But try not to compare yourself. Figure out what it is that you like to do, and then just do it. And don't feel like you need to do what other people are doing as well. Like if you like research, do research. If you don't like research, whatever, do what you like. Don't feel like there's a one pathway to getting into medical school, because there truly isn't. And then number two is find mentors. And this kind of brings me back to about how South Asians in general are a minority in our country, but not necessarily in medicine, right? Like it's very important to find a mentor, or a couple mentors who are just a couple years older than you, or a few years older than you, who are where you want to be when you're at that stage. And this could be something for even if you're in middle school, right? Like say like you're in middle school and you want to be a part of a certain organization in high school. Like identify people who are where you want to be and just talk to them. Figure out what they did to get there. Figure out what they wish they did that they didn't do. And that's the easiest way to get to where you want to be. Find somebody who you want to be and do everything that they did to get there. And that's really the easiest way. So one, don't compare don't compare yourself, and 2, find mentors.
Thank you. Those are some really good tips. Yeah, I definitely like the mentor one. That one is something that I think, and a lot of other people here will probably end up using, because I can't stress how much I like just don't hear that tip that much. However, I like know the importance of it, and like from what you're saying, it honestly seems like a much better way to go. And yeah, so thank you. Those are some good tips. Now my final,
definitely the easiest way.
yeah. My final question is, in your entire journey, if you could go back and do anything different, what would it be?
That's a loaded question. If I could do anything different, I guess it would be to not compare myself, to be honest, because especially in undergrad, there's a million and one ways to get into medical school, right? And you constantly feel like you should be doing these other things, and you constantly feel inadequate. But I wish I hadn't compared myself to those people, because you end up getting to the same place. And the thing is, like, when you're in the like midst of it, and when you're going through it, you don't see the end goal necessarily, but everybody's just, on their own path, and they eventually get to where they want to be. But yeah, like, I wish I didn't, compare myself, and I'm getting better at that now, which is why I'm telling you all not to compare yourself. But yeah, just like trust your journey, trust that it is yours, and yeah, like that you'll be okay in the end.
Thank you. Now I'm gonna give it back to Netra. She has some more questions. So yeah.
Yes, thank you, Aman. Well, actually, first I want to thank you, Spandana, for like answering all our questions so detailed. Yeah, I'm just gonna ask my first question. So, what exactly is a gap year, and like, why do people take a gap year?
Yeah, good question. So, a gap year is usually a year that people take between when they graduate college and before they matriculate into medical school. And there's a bunch of different reasons why people do this. The main reason is because the application process to get into medical school takes a whole year. So the application opens June 1st, and then you submit your application, secondaries, all that we talked about, interviews, and then you start medical school the following June, July, August, so the following summer. And the biggest reason why people take gap years is because that is a time-intensive process. If you are in your 4th year of undergrad and also going to these interviews, and they just kind of pop up, like they'll email you, be like, hey, you have an interview, and then you have to go to the interview in 2 weeks, or you have to go, schedule it in a month, and you don't know where you're going to be in your school curriculum. You don't know if you're going to have a midterm. You don't know if you're going to have, some like research presentation. So it becomes very difficult to balance that. And these interviews are very important. So people take a gap year, and during this gap year, they can work, they do research, they spend time with their families, they do something so that they can give themselves ample time to attend to the medical school admission process. So that's the number one thing. Number two reason why people take gap years or multiple gap years is to improve on something that was deficient in their application. So what could be deficient in your application? Say you don't have a good enough GPA, and say you want to, that's like the only thing that's really lacking in your application. You can take extra classes at your home institution. You can do what's called a post-bac program, which is basically the requirement classes that are required to get into medical school. And you just redo those and you get a good grade. And those grades replace the bad grades from the past. Some programs work like that. Some programs, those grades just add into your overall GPA. Regardless, the goal is to increase your GPA. Some people retake the Mcat. Some people use that year to get more clinical experience or do research. And some people just are plain burnt out by the end of college and they need a year to recuperate. And so some people just do that. My advice though is if you are deciding to take a gap year, have a purpose for that gap year, and have a plan. So for me personally, I wanted to retake my Mcat, and I just was not confident in my application during that before my 4th year to be able to apply and go straight in. So retaking my Mcat and also just giving myself a little bit of rest was what I wanted to do. But I had my plan to go work at Triage Consulting Company, where I learned a lot about healthcare that wasn't in the clinical realm. So that proved to be very useful for me. And the biggest regret that my peers, like my friends in the 3rd year right now have, is not taking at least one gap year. Because like I said, this is for the long run. It is a very tiring journey, albeit fulfilling. It is very tiring. So you want to make sure you have the steam to get you through. And sometimes that can be met with a lot of apprehension, especially from parents and, you know, people like that, which I get it. Like, I get why you would be worried. Like, why do you need a year to just not do something, right? Like, no other field has this concept. But to combat that, have a plan, have a purpose for that gap year, and work towards that, and have an idea of what you're going to do at the end of it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful information. My next question is, how important are foreign language credits when going into the medical pathway?
Do you mean like the languages that you take as a requirement in undergrad, or
Yes.
what do you mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay. To my knowledge, I don't believe there is a requirement for a foreign language for the medical school application. Usually undergraduate schools require that as a part of your graduation requirement. But that being said, if you know another language, it's very useful in the medical field. Primarily where we're from, Spanish. Like, if you know Spanish and you're confident in speaking Spanish, it will do wonders for you, because you will work with a lot of Spanish speaking people. But in terms of how important it is, and if you should take extra classes to, you know, just help your application, I don't think that is super important at all, to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what are the pros and cons of the pre-med pathway versus the BS pathway?
So pre-med versus BS pathway. So for the pre-med pathway, some schools offer this pathway. My school didn't offer this pathway. A lot of schools on the East Coast tend to offer like a pre-med pathway. All that means is they tell you which courses medical schools need as a requirement, and you're just on that path. But in the end, you still graduate with a bachelor's degree. In terms of the just BS pathway, you can still take, major in whatever you want, as long as you fulfill these requirements. And what are those requirements? They're like physics, chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry. I think that's English, I think. So as long as you fulfill those classes, it doesn't matter what major you pick. You could pick Bachelor of Arts. You could major in dance if you wanted to, as long as you fulfill these requirements. And all it comes down to is doing a little bit of planning with your counselor once you get into undergraduate. And then there's no distinguishing from an admissions point of view. Like, you don't have any advantage to choose the pre-med pathway over choosing, just majoring in something else. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So my next question is US history a requirement?
For undergrad, I think yes. For medical school, no, I don't think that you have to take like an extra US history requirement. But I think for undergrad, you have to take some sort of US history. So yeah.
Okay, and thank you. My next question is, are there any other pathways other than the pre-med pathway and the BS pathway?
To become a doctor or to become
Yeah, to become a
something
doctor.
else? So in undergrad, not necessarily, but there are 3 ways to become a doctor in the US, which I think I'll touch upon. So when you go to your undergrad, and you're close to graduating with whatever bachelor's degree you have, the 3 ways to get into a medical school and become a doctor in the US are: 1, you go to a US allopathic medical school. You go to a US osteopathic medical school, or you go to a international medical school. So US allopathic medical schools, if you graduate from there, you have an MD at the end of your name. If you graduate from a osteopathic medical school, you have a DO at the end of your name. And if you graduate from an international medical school, you have an MD at the end of your name. So regardless of where you go to medical school, everybody has the same requirements. You learn the same things. You take the same board exams. You have to qualify with the same, rights and privileges. You have all rights and privileges as a physician. You do residency, all of that. The difference, however, is the philosophy. So the amount of people who want to get into medical school is just way too much for the US to handle. There are not enough spots in the US to handle that many people. So people go to an MD school, they go to a DO school, and the only difference between those two is just the philosophy. DOs are traditionally taught in a more holistic sense, and they have a little bit more training in the musculoskeletal system. They tend to be primary care providers like family medicine, pediatrics, OBGYNs, but they can specialize in anything. And then in terms of international medical graduates, these are people who go to school outside of the US. So like the Caribbean, Canada, India, wherever, and then they come back and do a residency. So in terms of becoming a doctor, there's no difference up until you go to medical school. In terms of undergrad, there's really no difference at all.
Yeah, that was a good response. Also, there was a question in the chat, and I think it's a pretty good question. It's that, have you seen med students quit halfway through their program, and why? And how do you think it can be avoided?
Yeah, definitely. I'm trying to think, my first year of medical school, there were 3 people who dropped out. My second year of medical school, there were 3 people who took a break. The reason for this is more often than not burnout or family issues. So when I say burnout, what I mean is the just general culture of medicine, right? So there is so much information that you have to learn, and so much that you have to go through as a student that isn't always necessarily addressed by your school. And it's more of a mental health thing. And I think we're getting better with my generation and just the generation immediately above and below me, in the sense that we value balance a lot more than physicians who are in the older generation. We value being able to see our families. We speak up for that, right? Like we are speaking up for, you might have seen, so with the COVID vaccination, for example, medical students and residents are often the first people to go into the room when a patient is, needs attention. And yet we were one of the last people on the totem pole of healthcare providers to get a vaccine. And you can blame that on just, the administration, whatever, but it's part of the culture where people often feel undervalued. And so with that comes a lot of baggage and can cause people to really burn out. Another thing leading to burnout is administrative work. Healthcare, whether we like it or not, is a corporation, it is a business. So on top of caring for your patients, you really have to do a lot of, medical billing. You have to notate everything. You have to make sure that you cover your bases so nobody can sue you. And these are all things that nobody tells you until you get to like where I'm at. And so this can be a shock for a lot of people and can lead to burnout. And of course, there are family things that can go on. I had a lot of classmates who had, family issues that they just needed a break from. Or sometimes, they have children and they have to, take a break. So what's been nice, however, I will say with my school is regardless of the situation, they really try to get you to finish. They really, bend over and they really want to make sure that you can get to where you want to be because you do invest a lot in this journey. So that's really the biggest reason. And I think in medical school, you do see some people drop out, but in residence, especially because people are just overworked, underpaid, and not valued. So that's really what leads to it. And what we can do to combat it is by speaking up, by making this aware, that we exist and that, you need to care about medical students and residents. And we're slowly but surely getting on that path.
Okay, thank you. I have one final question, and then I'm going to pass it on to Samira. My last question is, does the pre-med pathway have a wider option for medical career choices than the BS pathway, or vice versa? Like if I decide to go to pre-med, to the pre-med pathway, and I decide I don't want to be a doctor, like I want to be like something else, but still in the medical path, would being a pre-med help me, or being a or going into the BS pathway?
Super good question. So like I want to reiterate that being quote unquote pre-med, all that means is that you are taking the required courses for medical school, right? So like the biochem, all that, what I mentioned before. That does not necessarily inhibit you from moving to a bachelor's or, moving career fields, because those requirements are more often than not the same requirements needed to go into some other healthcare field. So what I recommend is, unless you are 110% sure that you want to be a doctor and there's no doubt in your mind that you don't not want to be a doctor, get a bachelor's degree in something that you are interested in, because it is way easier for you to add on these requirements by just taking a couple extra classes in planning than it is for you to get your head fully set on medicine and not necessarily get something, learn something that you're interested in. So to get into dental school, what else, like optometry school, any of these other ancillary health professions, you usually need to take the same classes anyways. And as long as you are taking those requirements, then that's all that matters. But I do think it is important to get a bachelor's degree in something that you are truly interested in. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that answers it really well. Thank you. Okay, Samira, are you going to ask your questions?
Actually, in the interest of time, we're probably going to skip over those. And also, a lot of people are asking questions in the chat. So,
Oh yeah.
Spandana, if you want to go through and answer some that you think would be beneficial to everyone. Then.
Or if you'd like
okay,
us to read out the question, we can read it out for you.
It's okay. I'll just read it before I answer it. Okay, so I answered the first one. In order to get into medical school, what are some recommended AP courses? So AP courses really only matter for undergraduate school, for bachelor's. Once you get into undergraduate, nobody looks at AP courses anymore. They don't even look at your SAT score anymore. So only focus on AP courses to get into undergraduate school. Recommended ones, I know a lot of people do bio, US history, you know, whatever you're interested in and whatever you feel like you can do well in, take those courses, but use it only to get into bachelor's, because nobody even looks at it for medical school. Let's see. What do you think you did in high school that really helped you in the future years? I think the best thing to do in high school is to get involved in as many things as you possibly can. Baseline, keep your grades up. That's the most important. But aside from that, get involved in every possible thing that you have any interest in. So like what you guys are doing right now with, you know, the cultural society, awesome. Keep that, put that on your application. Get leadership. If you like playing a sport, play sport, get leadership in that. If you like playing an instrument and you're in band or orchestra, keep doing that. Eventually get leadership. So whatever you enjoy doing, stick with it and then get leadership. Because as soon as you can become a leader, that's when you really start understanding like what you can do for other people. And that's when you really start learning, right? So being involved in these cultural things, being involved in school, being involved in the community, and just really start to figure out what it is that makes you tick. What do you like? Like it could be something as simple as like making jewelry or something like that. If that's what you really like, figure out how you can take that to the next level. Build a small business, you know, like always be thinking about what the next level is. And I think in our community, we're really lucky to have a community that's so supportive. And so really take advantage of that as well. So get involved in as many things as you possibly can. And don't be afraid to be vulnerable, because that's the only way that you're going to learn things, okay? Is there a baseline passing score for the Mcat to get in, or is it holistic like the SAT or ACT? So this is actually actively changing. So when I took the Mcat, the average score was a 500, and they had actually just changed it over to the 3-digit scoring. There has been talk about fully eradicating the Mcat as a medical school admission guideline. I'm not sure that has actually happened yet, but baseline score, I want to say you want to do at least above average for whatever that previous year's matriculating class average is. And what's really nice is there's a website called AMCAS. I believe it's amcas.com or AAMCAS. And you can see the average score for all the medical schools in the United States, whether they accept it, and just their general matriculating class. So there usually is no like baseline passing score. It's just like you want to do well enough to hit their average score, and aim for a little bit above average. What do you do in residency, and do you have to do a certain exam after residency? Good question. So residency is where you learn to become a doctor. So after medical school, based on whatever specialty you choose. So specialties are surgery, family medicine, psychiatry, OBGYN, like internal medicine. Based on your specialty, you do a residency. Residencies last between 3 years and 7 years, depending on the specialty. And that's basically where you're learning to do everything on your own. In medical school, it's your first exposure to all of these different specialties. And then in residency is where you fully get trained to be the type of doctor that you're supposed to be. The exams that are required to get there and after residency, you take one board exam, after your second year of medical school, called step 1. That's quote unquote supposed to be the most important board exam, which will allow you to choose certain specialties that are more competitive. So the better you do, the more options you have. You take another board exam at the end of your third year, which is what I'm studying for right now, called step 2. And that exam is more clinically based. And then at the end of your first year of residency, you have to take step 3. Once you graduate from residency is when you become board certified in whatever type of doctor you want to be. So if you want to be a dermatologist, you have to take board certification in dermatology, and you have to renew that every 5 to 10 years to make sure that you are up on top of all the information and all the evidence-based medicine. So all the doctors you go to are consistently taking exams every 5 to 10 years, even after they graduate residency. Medical school is perceived more expensive than other fields, and that too over a longer period of time. What are some ways to overcome that barrier? Yes, medical school is an investment financially, definitely. Most people take loans to pay for medical school. And ways to overcome that barrier is to know that you will be making enough money to pay it back, and to trust in yourself that you will be able to pay it back. So although doctors may not make as much money as businessmen and things like that, they will over time make enough money to pay loans back, usually in 5 to 10 years. If you work for a federally qualified health center, after you graduate from residency, they often will help pay for your loans back. You can also do National Health Service scholarships, where if you pledge to work in a underserved community, they will pay for your medical school. And you can also do similar to what ROTC is in undergrad. You can do that for medical school, where the US government will pay for your medical school as long as you pledge to serve in the Army, Navy, Air Force, whatever branch of military, for X amount of years after you graduate residency. So there is a lot of angst in terms of going to medical school. It was definitely one of my and my family's worries when I was deciding to go to medical school. But what you have to, I think, believe and understand is that once you graduate, you will get those loans paid off. And there are a lot of other benefits for being a physician that I am slowly learning as well, in terms of breaks that you get in terms of mortgages and things like that, which I'd be happy to talk about, another time as well. But it is possible to pay it back, and it'll be good. Yes, there will be a recording.
And if anyone else has any final questions, we will be closing the floor. Yeah.
One last question I got in the chat.
Yeah.
Yes, it's really quick.
Yeah.
Yes, 1 second.
And this will
No
probably
problem.
be our last question in the interest of time. It's been a very long and fruitful discussion. So yeah.
Definitely.
Yes. So the final
I will
question.
put my. Sorry, go ahead.
Is there any contact which we can reach out to if we have any questions in the future?
Yes, I was actually just about to say that. I will put my email in the chat. You all are welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions. I know that there's a lot unsaid about the medical field, and I am glad that you guys had this session. So if anyone would want to reach out to me, or if your parents have more questions that they would like to have answered, they are welcome to contact me.
Okie dokie. And I think there's one last question, and then after this, I think we'll do the conclusion. So how do you know / get access to different opportunities in undergrad?
You seek them out. one of the great things about being a college student is that nothing is ever handed to you. So you have to seek them out. So go to, I feel like every university has like a 0 week where it's like you go to school and you move into your dorm or your apartment and you don't have classes yet, but it's just a time for you to like get used to the school. And they have like club fairs and things like that. So go to club fairs, learn about what organizations they have, learn about what they stand for, figure out what you're interested in, and then join them. Join more than you feel like you would want to, because you never know how you're going to make these connections. And it's also a fun time. Like if you feel like you've always wanted to do something, but you never really had the guts to do it, like just sign up anyways. So that's usually like these club fairs, word of mouth, there are flyers everywhere. I know with COVID, it's like a different world right now, but in a typical time, these are usually all there. And I'm sure universities are doing similar things virtually as well, or at least have them on their websites. So they're usually big events that you can go to.
Okay, thank you. So finally, I just wanted to say thank you, Spandana, for taking the time to talk to us about med school and pre-med and your entire journey and like anything you had to say. It definitely was a lot of good advice, and I'm sure a lot of us are probably going to use it in the future. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. And thank you everyone who joined this interactive discussion. I hope it helped everyone a lot. Yeah, so.
Well, thank you all for having me. You guys were great as well. If you all have any questions, you feel free to reach out to me via email. And you know, if you need a mentor, I am here. But wish you all the best of luck.
Yes, thank you, Spandana, for taking the time, like Kaman said, and for all your patient and detailed answers. It's going to be very useful for not only me, but everyone in this meeting.
You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you for coming here today, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, Spandana. I really, this really helped.
And look out for
Are you guys
next
interested
month's-
in?
Oh,
Are you all
sorry.
interested in going to the medical field?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, like all of you? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And to everyone who is here right now, just heads up, look out for next month's meeting. We will be having a meeting next month, and it'll be with like a leadership council, like an international leadership council. So yeah, just look out for that. Yeah, so thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, bye, you guys. Have a good night.
Thank you for joining us. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.